Hi, my name is Leslie Head. I'm from the School of Geography at the University of Melbourne. I want to acknowledge that we're standing on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and acknowledge their elders past, present and future. So I'm speaking to you from the Melbourne General Cemetery, which is behind me, and we're just north of the University of Melbourne. So I want to use the image and the idea of the cemetery to respectfully think about issues of loss and mourning in relation to climate change. So I'm focusing today on the role of emotions in responding to climate change, and that's an argument that I've developed in more depth in this book, Hope and Grief in the Anthropocene, which was published by Routledge in 2016. So I'm going to draw on feminist analyses of emotions to help think through some aspects of grief and then hope. So there are many ways that feminist analysis can help us in thinking about climate change and how we respond to it, but I'm just focusing today on this particular aspect. So the diverse manifestations of what we might think of as an environmental grieving process are being identified by a number of scholars and writers, and many works now identify aspects of grief, loss and mourning in relation to climate change. This includes studies of the actual or anticipated loss of beloved places, for example through melting snow and ice pack in the Northern Hemisphere, through sea level rise and through changing ecological relationships. Increasingly, all sorts of people are writing about their emotional responses to climate change, whether or not their involvement is professional. So all of us who care are doing emotional labour around climate change. So these empirical studies provoke important questions for us, I think, in a context of strong social and cultural pressure to be positive rather than negative. And I want to argue that a relentless cultural disposition to focus on the positive is itself a kind of denial. So I'm connecting here to anthropologist Kari Norgaard's work in a small town in Norway, and her analysis of what she calls everyday denial. We misread this argument, by the way, if we focus only on the so-called climate change deniers and instead fail to see the extent to which we're all implicated in the denial of climate change and how everyday denial pervades all our lives. So how can feminist analysis help us undo the binary between rationality and emotion? And the work of writers such as Val Plumwood and Sarah Ahmed is particularly important in this discussion. In the history of evolutionary thinking, emotions were long understood as primitive and corresponding to the animal-like stage of evolution. So a physiological view of emotion has been seen as the antithesis of rationality. But Ahmed has shown us how emotion was viewed as separate from and beneath the faculties of thought and reason. So to be emotional is to have one's judgment affected, it's to be reactive rather than active, and dependent rather than autonomous. Recent work in both the sciences and the humanities, philosophy, psychology, physiology, as well as feminist analyses, challenge this strict dichotomy between emotion and reason. What's significant in this literature is how people deal with emotion in rational ways, making practical choices about the best way to deal with experiences of fear, anxiety, love and pleasure. Now, in the course of writing about grief and hope, I went to interview some climate scientists. So here's a group of people whose day job is modelling the end of the world as we know it, if you like, and I wanted to know how they felt about this. The particular framing of overt climate denialism has forced scientists to emphasise science as truth, science as unemotional, themselves as dispassionate. We can see how and why that's happened, but an unfortunate side effect, I think, has been that the only emotions most climate scientists feel they can give voice to are positive ones. This attempt to separate emotion and reason was a common theme in my interviews with climate scientists. These were all Australian climate scientists, by the way. They spoke of the crucial importance of doing rigorous science as underpinning everything their work entailed and the basis of their professional reputations. One of them, I'll call Jeff, described this as keeping the heart a long way from the brain. For Jeff, emotions were to be distanced from rational thinking in order to produce accurate and reliable data. In a similar way, Gary acknowledged the emotional dimensions of the scientific projections and data that he helped to produce, yet he illustrated how he finds it necessary to actively eliminate these, saying, quote, "I would prefer to describe what constitutes a catastrophe rather dispassionately without taking on the emotional impact of that," unquote. So the context in which these scientists are working includes not only the masculinist science model, but also an intense public debate around their truth claims. They're constantly having to defend themselves and their work against climate change denialists. So they can only keep going by doing a huge amount of emotional labour to build on Ali Hochschild's concept. This labour includes disciplining themselves against the norm of dispassionate science. They try and switch off at home. They don't talk to their kids about climate change. They don't talk to taxi drivers. And they don't even talk in social situations very much. Just to read a few quotes. So this is explored also in a paper in Emotion, Space and Society that I published with Teresa Harada last year. So just to read a quote from Karen, illustrating how social situations have the potential to become a site of conflict for her and anxiety. She says, "Oh God, I never tell them in a social situation that I'm a climate scientist. It usually descends into them shouting at you, or like telling you either you're not doing enough or you're doing too much." Or another one called Linda, asked how she tries to deal with the emotional aspects of climate change, says, "I actually deliberately block it out as much as I can when I'm away from work. So I really try to not to, because I don't think I'd be in very good shape if I let myself think about it all the time." So there's a denial for you. I have to say, to be brutally honest, I tend not to look at the future too much because it's very confronting. I have kids. So that's Linda. So as you can see from these examples, there's quite a lot of work that these scientists are doing to manage their own emotions as well. They're engaging in what one of them called compulsory optimism. So what are the consequences of all this? And I'm not picking on the poor old climate scientists here, so even though some of them might benefit, I think, from reading a bit of supportive feminist analysis, but I think in some ways they're an example that we could all kind of connect to. One consequence is that it contributes to what Kane and Bruce and co-authors call erring on the side of least drama. Their work shows how the dispassionate norm in science leads to scientists being, quote, biased not towards alarmism, but rather the reverse, unquote. So a kind of systematic downplaying of the likelihood of catastrophe. In another example, Lauren Rickards and her colleagues identified strong parallels between masculinism, rationality and optimism in their analysis of how senior decision makers respond to climate change. So you can imagine the kind of policy decisions that might lead to. But as Katrina McKinnon has written, it's not obvious that people in despair about tackling climate change are making a mistake. Rather, we could suggest that they're taking a rational approach to managing their emotional responses. So the conventional wisdom on this is that fear and pessimism won't do it. So what do we do? A common response is we're urged to stay positive, to be optimistic. So the labour of optimism and its companion, the suppression of doom and gloom, conform to feeling rules frequently observed in Western culture. The expectation to manage emotions, to remain optimistic and thus emphasise pleasurable emotions over painful ones. But I want to reject the cultural assumption that even to canvass these issues or discuss these themes is to give in to them, or to give up, or to assume the worst. So how can all this pain and negative stuff be generative? Basically, I want to argue that grief is a companion that will increasingly be with us, as it's with us in life every day, and more open acknowledgement of that fact will strengthen our collective capacities. The specific expressions of grief will be variable, and much more discussion is needed as to how they can be incorporated creatively into everyday life. But the evidence from the psychological and psychoanalytical literature, which I haven't had time to go into today, is clear that the first step is to acknowledge this companion. Sally Weintraub uses this term bearing our anxieties, and it has the self-evident meaning of to carry. But the tone of these arguments is broader, perhaps in the mode of childbearing. It's also about holding, articulating, bearing witness to, and rendering visible. So on this reading, grief is not something we can get beyond, rather it has to become part of our lives and our politics. Bearing our grief will not necessarily stave off catastrophe, but it will give us a better chance of effective action. So what does that make hope? Well, hope is a risky and complex process of possibility. In particular, I suggest we need to decouple hope from emotion. Decouple hope and optimism, and recognise that a broader range of emotions, including painful ones, are entangled in hope. So hope is conceptualised instead as a kind of embodied practice. It's something to be practiced rather than felt. Finally, I just want to say that I think there are particular responsibilities for scholars in this kind of bearing, and there are also risks. The work we have to do is emotional as well as everything else. Grief and mourning are our companions in the research enterprise as well as in everyday life. As researchers, students and activists, we're not immune from the emotional costs of this, and we need to look out for one another. Thank you very much for listening.